Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the latest in our series of ENO Center for Transportation webinars. My name is Ramik Avaz, and I'm a policy analyst here at ENO, and I'm joined by my colleagues and co-authors, Brianne Eby, Senior Policy Analyst, and Paul Lewis, Vice President of Policy and Finance. Today, we are presenting the findings and recommendations from ENO's newest report, Saving Time and Making Sense, which investigates the high costs and long timelines for building public transportation projects in the United States. You can enter questions in the box on the side of your screen at any time as we present, and we'll get to as many as possible during the Q&A. If you're interested in diving deeper into our work and learning more about this issue, ENO is hosting a 4-day virtual symposium on project delivery in October that you can register for now. More details and the link to registration should be in your chat box, as well as a link to access and download our full report. You'll be able to find slides and a recording of this webinar on our website, enotrans.org, and the recording is going to be emailed to all registrants within a day. So to kick things off, I'm going to briefly cover our goals and initial data findings from our report. Next slide, or next two slides, please. Next slide. So the ENO team had 4 main goals as part of this 18-month-long research initiative. First, we sought to investigate the extent to which construction costs and timelines are higher in the US through an analysis of construction costs and timeline data in the United States and peer countries abroad. Second, we sought to understand and distill down some of the key issues and themes surrounding the delivery of transit projects through an intensive literature review, interviews, and case studies. Third, we sought to, through our qualitative and quantitative research, develop solid and actionable recommendations to address the key cost and timeline drivers that we identified in our report through recommendations for private and public sector officials at all levels of government. And lastly, we sought to build a network of stakeholders, peer researchers, and experts in this field to foster a national conversation around project delivery and the necessary actions we have to take to build transit better and make sure that we are getting the most bang for our buck. Next slide. To do this, we used a four-part methodology. First, we had a high-level advisory panel consisting of experts from academia, the public and private sectors at all levels of government who provided input and feedback as we crafted our research scope and gave us feedback on drafts and research products from the very beginning to the very end of this process. The second piece of this methodology was, of course, a quantitative component, which is a database of 180 transit projects in the United States and Europe with the data on construction costs, timelines, stations, and grade alignment to investigate, again, the extent to which our projects cost more and take longer to build than our peers abroad. The third piece is an intensive background guide and literature review to identify some of the key cost and timeline drivers affecting projects in the United States, which of course informs the types of questions that we asked in our interviews and in our case study, regional case studies, which gave us specific anecdotes, revealed best practices, and gave us some more insights into what's happening on the ground. Next slide. So as part of this project, we conducted 9 case studies of transit buildouts in the US and in Western Europe and Canada. On the domestic front, we looked at transit buildouts in Los Angeles, Denver, Seattle, and Minneapolis. Internationally, we looked at Madrid, Copenhagen, Paris, and Toronto. And to get a better idea of how governance and standards and processes for project delivery differ among highway projects in the United States and transit projects in the US, we compared the I-495 hot lanes to the Silver Line extension here in Northern Virginia, again, to keep geography constant and get a better idea of the types of factors affecting both types of projects in the US. Next slide. So our literature review identified 11 primary cost and timeline drivers that we roughly categorized into 3 groups. The first is governance, which includes, for example, the overall structure of the project sponsor or the agency or construction authority responsible for delivering the project, staff capacity, the decision to utilize in-house staff versus hiring consultants, among many others. The second bucket is processes, which includes things like the environmental review, utility relocation, and land acquisition. The third piece is standards, which includes things like Buy America, labor protections, design requirements, and fire safety codes. As you can see in this Venn diagram, all of these drivers can overlap. For example, environmental review entails a set of standards that projects have to meet, but it's also a formal process that projects have to go through. So it's important for us to acknowledge that these cost drivers don't exist in a vacuum and they overlap, but also distinguish what we're talking about when we talk about environmental review. Are we talking about the standards, or are we talking about the processes? So this slide here captures the 11 drivers that form the basis of the interviews and questions that we asked as part of our case studies. Next slide. So now I'm going to briefly cover some of the high-level takeaways from our data analysis. Our first major finding was that the United States pays nearly 50% more to build transit on a per-mile basis than peer countries. This is true, as you can see on the graph, when you isolate for both fully at-grade projects as well as fully tunnel projects. The construction cost premium gets slightly worse as you tunnel, and if you include the outlier projects, the Second Avenue subway and 7-line extension in New York City, the tunneling cost premium rises to 250%. And this is not including some of the projects that are currently underway in Los Angeles, Seattle, and that have been proposed in places like Austin. The other main finding is that the United States takes longer to construct public transit projects than abroad. For mostly at-grade projects, we found that it takes 6 months longer to build, and for fully tunneled projects or mostly tunneled projects, we found that it takes over 1.5 years longer to build. Our analysis also found a very strong correlation between construction timelines and construction costs, which further reinforces the idea that time is money. So we have a lot more to cover and a lot more in our recommendations. So I'm going to hand it over to Paul to kick off our conversation about some of the key recommendations to address our cost and timeline issues. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Ramek. Appreciate that. And so for the next little bit here, what we're going to do is just walk through the areas that we have of findings and recommendations. And we've divided those into 3 categories. As Ramek talked about earlier, we've got our governance, our processes, and our standards section. And so I'm going to talk through the governance section here first. And I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Brianne, who's going to talk through the processes, and then Ramek through the standards. And there's a lot of overlap and interrelated aspects of these, but I think that it was really helpful when we're talking about how do we address certain cost drivers that we categorize them in this way. And so let me go on to the next slide here. Okay. So the first thing we need to do is, and again, I'm talking here about governance, is really talk about getting the institution, the oversight, and the governance right from the start. And this is a kind of an issue that doesn't come up a lot when we think about transit delivery, but it is so critical to making a successful project. And I think one of the underlying factors that you'll see weaved through here is that public transit agencies in the United States, they're the primary builder of transit, they're institutions that are really designed not to do that. They're really designed to operate transit, right? And a transit agency is, on its day-to-day, is mostly running buses, running trains, doing some maintenance on that infrastructure and vehicles. And then once a decade, we tell that agency, oh yeah, go ahead and build a huge multi-billion-dollar complex mega project. And they're just not designed to do that. And so these recommendations are really targeted at that governance component. And to start, we look at the public institution charged with leading the delivery of transit, which is usually a transit agency or some kind of project sponsor. It has to have a couple components that need to be in place to make it successful, particularly when we look at the board structure, when we look at the authorities that it has, and then the staff that it brings on. We found that in a lot of other countries, they've had success with special purpose delivery vehicles or independent construction authorities, like they created in Madrid or in Copenhagen, as a new entity that can bring on these types of attributes that make a project successful. But you could also modify an existing institution to bring these things on. And they are first, as we mentioned, the board of directors needs to have the relevant stakeholders, including the jurisdictions in which our funding and in which this traverses, as part of that board structure. And they do 2 things. One, they help grease the wheels a little bit to make sure that the project can move forward. And it also brings a level of accountability to the project. So when there is an issue, we can point to a specific board member that's representing a specific stakeholder group and have them resolve that particular issue. Second is on the authorities piece, is kind of talking about this organization has to have the ability to do a bunch of different things, including issue debt when that's applicable, to acquire land, relocate utilities, and secure its own permits, right? And this last part's really important because too often these construction authorities or these transit agencies don't have the ability to move their transit project forward until they get permits from a local city or a local jurisdiction. And so then they don't really have control over the timeline and construction timeline of their project, and that's really problematic. And then finally, these institutions need to have the right staff to manage the project. And they need to be in-house public sector staff. The institution needs to have the ability to have sufficient salary budget and ability to hire at competitive wages with the private sector, and not necessarily bring on a consultant staff to manage a project, but really bring all of that in-house at competitive rates, so we have the best experience from around the country and perhaps around the world managing this project. Moving on to the letter B here on this slide, we have a lot in here about project delivery methods, and then what we're talking about here is the procurement, whether it's design, bid, build, or design, build, or PPP, or CMGC. There's lots of different flavors that a project can choose, and when we talk to folks, there's a lot of opinions on which one is best. And what we found in our work is that there isn't necessarily one that is better than the other. What matters much more is whether an agency is committed to it, whether they understand that particular delivery method or procurement method, and they commit to it for the duration of the procurement and the project. For example, a lot of agencies will choose a design build method in an effort to cap costs and speed up timelines, and then they'll manage it as if it's a design bid build, and they'll have lots of input on the design, and they'll go back and make lots of changes midway through the project, and that leads to lots of change orders and lots of scope creep and timeline increases that can be really problematic. So then within that, the third thing here on this letter C, is that a couple things in terms of best practices that go along with that. Looking internationally, very rarely do you see multi-billion-dollar contracts. In fact, when we looked at our European and Canadian partners, we found that projects are kind of divided up, and contracts are capped at around $300 million per contract, and the lines can be segmented, and that achieves a couple things. One, it brings more competition because smaller construction firms can bid on the project. And two, if there's a problem with a contractor or contract, the agency can focus on that while everything else still continues. Whereas here in the United States, we tend to bid everything out into one very large contract, and we get some problems associated with that. There's some language in our report about procurement goals, and this is referring to, I think, important things like disadvantaged business enterprise goals, local hire goals, Buy America, those kind of things. These are all important programs, but often the targets are set too high or unrealistic. And so then the private sector and the public sector spend a lot of administrative time trying to ensure compliance and don't often get it. And so that in and of itself can be a big problem and an administrative burden. And then in the United States, we have a tendency to use lowest costs as our evaluator for bids, and we in some cases required to pick the lowest cost bid, whereas in other countries they've kind of moved beyond that and go with best value, where cost is only a portion of the overall evaluation, and other things like experience and qualifications and adherence to timeline matter much more than cost. And while you don't always end up going with the lowest bid, you get a much better quality outcome. You have a much better highly likelihood of working with a contractor that will keep that original bid in their final deal. And then finally, we have a lot here on agency staff and staffing. We looked a lot into workforce, and a little surprised that when we were talking in our case studies, there wasn't much of an emphasis on a need to target the unionized frontline workforce as a way to save money. And of course, US projects cost more because US projects have to absorb things like healthcare costs and retirement benefit costs that other countries don't have to. But within the areas that an agency can actually control, like work rules and overtime and salary rates, there isn't necessarily a huge need to address that, except for a couple of examples we found in places like New York, where at least from what we've read and we've talked to folks, there seems to be a problem there. And that is going to be subject of future work that we have coming on. Where the real problem is in terms of staffing is on the public sector side, not only what we were talking about earlier in terms of hiring the right staff, but also training mid-manager staff, really supporting them and understanding, how to deliver and manage a huge project like this. That also means bringing in expertise from other institutions that have done this. Highway departments of transportation, Federal Highway Administration, Federal Transit Administration are great resources for kind of elevating the staff and bringing them in-house, bringing them the kind of expertise they need. And all this is pointing to less reliance on consultants to do some of the work that the public sector in-house staff can and should be doing. Consultants do great work and they should be leveraged, but not necessarily in the way that we do typically in the United States. So I'm gonna stop there. I see there's a bunch of questions coming in, and we're gonna get to questions about the governance stuff in a few minutes. But first, I'm gonna turn it over to my colleague Brianne, who's gonna talk through the recommendations and findings that we have on the processes side. Brianne.
Excellent, thank you, Paul. So Paul just talked through the people and the institutions that are involved in carrying out transit projects, and specifically his last point about building staff capacity and staff training is something that I'll talk a little bit more about in this section. So I'll be digging deeper into the processes and the procedures that go into delivering projects. And the idea here is that from project planning on through construction, many of the practices that are used to deliver projects ultimately function as sticking points due to cumbersome or in some cases outdated processes. And smoothing out some of these sticking points can ultimately make it easier to build more and better transit projects. So what I'll be discussing today are the processes that are specifically related to the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, utility relocation, land acquisition, and community engagement. And so the first set of ideas or recommendations that we have is around the NEPA law and the process for NEPA in the United States. And so what the general takeaway for the first set of recommendations is that the NEPA statute itself doesn't need to be reformed, but the processes by which federal agencies reach a record of decision could use some reforms. So something that we uncovered in our research is that many other countries have similar standards in place as ours with respect to environmental protection. So what we focused on instead was then how the processes for conducting environmental review in the US may be different and particularly burdensome compared to some other places. So our first recommendation is that Congress should create a pilot program to allow the Federal Transportation Secretary to exempt select public transportation projects from NEPA if they're able to meet certain criteria. So for example, if they have a robust community engagement process, that's an important point there. And an example that we found in our research was that in Toronto, so Ontario's transit project assessment process has allowed transit projects to be exempt from the provincial environmental assessment and to use essentially their own condensed environmental review process, which takes less than 2 years. So that's one potential model there. Another recommendation that we have with respect to NEPA is that FTA should execute an agreement with federal agencies to commit to working together. So environmental review for a project can involve more than 30 different federal authorizations, and for each of these authorizations, a separate agency prepares and reviews the documents. And the result can often be an uncoordinated or sometimes even duplicative process that takes a long time to deliver given the different pace and experience in executing this process among the different agencies. And so, often what this results in is project sponsors don't even know which authorizations apply before they enter the environmental review phase. And so part of addressing this problem is the One Federal Decision executive order, which directed federal agencies to develop a single timetable and record of decision rather than going through each agency's process piecemeal. The Biden administration initially revoked this, but there's indication that it plans to reinstate the order, and our recommendations that reissuing it, but with an emphasis on better coordination and especially face-to-face meetings between the different federal agencies, and consolidating the different timelines can help to move projects along faster. Another point that I'll make about NEPA and the environmental review process is one of our recommendations that Congress should dedicate more resources to the FTA to increase staffing in their regional offices and to help assist transit agencies with preparing and coordinating their environmental documents. So one of the things that we learned in our highway case study was that whereas Federal Highway Administration regional offices are located within each of the 50 states, FTA field offices are regional and cover multiple states. And so what this means is that local project sponsors may not have close or easy access to FTA staff. And so when combined with the fact that large transit projects are less commonly built than highway projects in the US, there's kind of this underlying sense that less public sector capacity to build, that there's less public sector capacity to build transit projects. And again, this can often result in risk averse or maybe inefficient approaches. So I'll move on to the second set of recommendations around investing in staff capacity. So the overall theme here is that states and project sponsors need to invest in the staff and the processes for their own permitting and environmental review. So one recommendation that we have is that transit project sponsors should borrow staff from state DOTs, NPOs, and the Federal Highway Administration strategically to assist with preparing environmental documents. So again, since highway projects are more regularly built, that means that there's often a more routinized approach to processes like environmental review, and there's also more experienced public sector staff rather, to build those projects. So, while highway officials certainly try to avoid NEPA-related litigation, it does occur regularly enough. We uncovered this in one of our interviews that, agencies recognize litigation to be a part of the process, and they have the staff and the documents ready to manage that litigation. And so transit agencies can borrow from this deep experience on the highway side to improve their own processes. Another recommendation is that transit project sponsors should exercise constraint in their alternatives analysis. Another thing that we heard in our interviews was that transit project sponsors tend to evaluate more alternatives than highway project sponsors do through this process. A 2020 CEQ revision to federal regulations constrained the range of alternatives that need to be considered through environmental review. And so transit agencies could take advantage of this and only examine really those alternatives that are within their stated purpose and need. The next set of recommendations is around the community and stakeholder engagement process, and we're saying that this needs greater investment and ultimately more attention. One big recommendation to come from our report is that project sponsor staff should be more empowered to make tough decisions on project scope and requests that arise during the planning and construction phases. So additional staff and resource capacity should be directed toward community engagement, and especially toward factoring in different forms of community engagement that can allow for diverse perspectives to be brought into the process. And this should ultimately be transparently documented to ensure that the final decisions that are made on a project are socially equitable. At the same time, public sector transit agency staff should be more empowered to make some tough decisions about projects at key points in the process, and not be tempted to defer too much to community input that can result in scope creep. So an example here is that in Los Angeles, interviewees suggested that in some cases, municipalities may delay or condition the approval of some project-specific permits on whether the agency there, LA Metro, implements the jurisdiction's betterment requests. So in 2013, LA Metro adopted a policy that formalizes how betterments can be requested and are evaluated. the idea is that the agency staff are subject matter experts that represent the public. And so again, just should be empowered to make some tough decisions. Another recommendation with respect to community engagement is that project sponsors should work with the community to recognize some of the trade-offs that are associated with building and to push for greater, maybe more intense short-term disruption in order to advance the construction process a little bit faster. So here I'll give an example of tunneling work for LA's Purple Line Beverly Hills station that we heard from our interviews. Prior to the pandemic, the work for that project would have only been completed on weekends and allowed traffic to resume during the work week to minimize disruption. That's something that's a pretty common approach for transit projects in the US. And this approach can ultimately draw out timelines and I mean, really the project is still disruptive, it's just disruptive over a longer period of time. So when the pandemic hit, LA Metro was able to complete the work much faster since there were fewer cars on the road, and the station ultimately was completed 7 months sooner than anticipated. And this was possible because of, certainly extenuating circumstances, but project sponsors, much, like this example here, have a choice to pursue faster timelines if they're willing to accept a bit more disruption. The final set of recommendations is around the policy and practice reforms that are needed to address shortcomings related to the utility relocation and land acquisition processes. So utility relocation involves first identifying the utility infrastructure that will be affected by construction, but then coordinating with the relevant public or private utility companies to make those relocations happen. Given the complexity of these processes, the main takeaway here is to dedicate staff with expertise early on and to come to those agreements early on. An example to outline this, so once again, LA Metro dedicated more staff to handling their third-party interfaces on major projects, and they initiated earlier contracts with utility owners and municipalities after a bunch of delays associated with relocation on the Expo Line project. The agency awarded a separate contract for utility identification and relocation prior to awarding the full design build contract for the Purple Line to prevent relocation issues from impacting the larger multi-billion-dollar, in that case, project contract. And much of these lessons apply also for land acquisition. So in the Seattle region, land acquisition can take up to 2 years. So the transit agency there, Sound Transit, addressed this by engaging in early discussions with property owners and brought in experienced right-of-way staff from the state DOT to help with the process. So I will leave it there for processes and turn it over to Ramik to take us through some of the standards next.
Thanks, Brianne. So the final set of recommendations we have is a little bit broader and focuses on the general framework for how we think about projects, the standards that we apply to them, and the just general policy environment in which transit as a whole operates. So I'll start off with the first bullet here, bullet A, where we recommend that we de-emphasize customization in favor of standardized designs to save on construction costs and speed up projects. This was a common finding throughout a lot of our case studies, and an area where we uncovered some best practices abroad. Of course, transit has the power to shape a community and the built environment around it, and certainly aesthetics and design are a critical piece of the puzzle when it comes to building transit that folks are going to enjoy and use and embed as part of their community. But what we found is that in the US, at least, there's often an over-reliance on using bespoke exotic materials, custom rolling stock, and grandiose stations that can inflate costs, lead to longer timelines, more expensive maintenance, let alone potential interoperability issues among rapid transit and commuter rail, and there's this idea that there's just a patchwork of custom rolling stock in each and every city for each and every system that can be at a certain point inefficient. And we found that whenever possible, standardizing plans, borrowing designs can save costs, and in a case like Copenhagen, even lead to some innovative designs that are really cool and really useful, but still manage to save costs. And so the Copenhagen example really stood out in this case. So in Copenhagen, when they were building their first metro system, their first rapid transit system, the officials opted to use a largely off-the-shelf automated train from an Italian manufacturer. And this is the same model that's been used in other automated systems. It's essentially a people mover that's been used elsewhere in Europe and in some systems in Asia, as well as in the Middle East. These trains are, of course, shorter than the typical rapid transit or subway train that you might see, but because they're automated and shorter, they're able to run every 100 seconds. And as a result, the architects were able to significantly shrink the footprint of their stations and make it so that they can fit under existing parks and plazas really easily. This not only reduced the amount of excavation that they needed to do in Copenhagen, but it also reduced the amount of property that needed to be acquired. And because the stations had such a small footprint, they were nestled in really nicely with the existing urban fabric. And so we found that, officials in Copenhagen decided that they were not going to over-design their stations to meet peak capacity and leave that space largely unutilized, during off-peak hours, and instead just have shorter automated trains that run very, very frequently so that you don't have to sacrifice capacity and trade that off for the station size. Another really interesting architectural best practice that we found in Copenhagen was standardizing as many elements of the stations that they could to be either 18 feet long or wide. So that, for example, if you have a wall cladding or a door or a glass panel that is broken and needs to be replaced, you can swap it out easily at a relatively inexpensive cost, and you don't have to go and import get a custom size tile built or have to import some exotic material. We also found that in Los Angeles, there's been a recent standardization policy that LA Metro implemented, where they're again trying to utilize similar materials, resilient materials and designs on stations going forward. And so both in Copenhagen and LA, this was kind of called a kit of parts or approach, where again, there are some standardized parts and materials and designs that can be reused on stations. And we found that this is something that was really helpful in Copenhagen and something that folks and architects there said contributed to their efficient system. In Copenhagen, one of the only elements that were customized were the color of those standardized wall panels. So if you go visit Copenhagen and you see the stations and the escalator into those stations, there are these panels of on the walls, and they customize the color and the patterns on those walls to make sure that each station did kind of have its own unique feel and fit in with the community in a way that didn't rely on bespoke materials or require too much added expense. Similarly, when we profiled the subway build out in Madrid, which was among the cheapest and most inexpensive on a per mile basis by far that we profiled across Europe, folks there cited the copy and paste, no frills, standardized station design across their entire system as one of the reasons why they were able to save a lot of costs. And so again, this fits in terms of a pattern we've seen that the US just relies a lot on over customization and often does not incorporate international best practices in our designs. And so this recommendation really speaks to the benefits that we can get by standardizing and adopting other people's and other systems' designs, sharing best practices, sharing designs that work, and focusing on the function rather than just the appearance of our systems. Another area of standardization that we found was contracting. In Europe, we saw that projects often utilized standardized terms for construction contracts, and they included frameworks, for example, for tunneling contracts that have guidance for risk sharing, and the use of these standardized contracts led to fewer legal disputes. And so we have a recommendation in our report that calls for the adoption of a similar approach here in the United States, modeled off of the standardization that we have in Europe, to reduce contentious legal disputes and have some more effective and standardized contracting. Another area that's really ripe for revisiting are construction standards like the fire code. And again, going back to Copenhagen, we saw that other regions we profiled had some very creative ways of meeting fire safety regulations and cutting back on costs without necessarily sacrificing safety. So in the Copenhagen stations, again, if you visit those stations, there are skylights that are built in at the top of each of the stations. And so they serve a dual purpose. Not only do they let natural light go all the way into the platform, but they also double as NFPA compliant ventilation devices. And so this was part of, again, of a deliberate choice on behalf of the architects who were tasked with by the agency to be as creative as you can when you're trying to meet the fire code. And by incorporating skylights that functioned as natural ventilation devices, they were able to cut down by 1/3 on the number of escape shafts that they had to build, and they didn't have to embed as much costly ventilation devices because they had some of that naturally built into the station. And so when we spoke with people and we spoke with architects and experts, we found that to the extent that we can make these codes more innovative, more flexible, and more performance-based, we can really lead to some better station design. And so we have a recommendation in here too about calling for agencies and organizations who are involved in transit to launch a review of all of our construction standards and find opportunities to make them more performance-based. Some of our future work will be looking at Asia, and there's been a lot of very interesting, flexible, performance-based fire standards that we've seen come out of Japan. And another point I'll make on NFPA 130, we heard that even though there are certain elements to the extent that specify you have to be able to evacuate a station in X minutes, and there are a lot of elements of our fire code that again lead to this over-designing of our stations. And so we'll talk about this more at the symposium, but we again believe that we can really revisit some of our construction standards and revisit the basis of them and how we can make them more flexible, more performance-based, and more innovative. Another point that we've seen as well is just in general, we have a recommendation that agencies, both federally and locally, should have dedicated programs for international best practice exchange, specifically for project delivery and for design, which includes but is certainly not limited to regular city tours. The FTA has an international arm that does a lot of technical capabilities exchange and a lot of exchange on things like mobility on demand. And so we think that extending that to project delivery and architecture will certainly be helpful to make sure that project sponsors are continuously in contact with their counterparts abroad and incorporating best practices. The second bullet point here talks about the need for transit to maximize its public benefit. And so again, while it's important for project sponsors to be mindful of the public dollars they're spending, it's also important for project sponsors to make sure that the transit systems that they're building are useful and successful. And across the United States, we found that project sponsors often route projects along what we call the path of least resistance, either through existing freeway or freight rail rights of way, which is often done to avoid taking lanes from cars, impacting utilities, interfacing with communities. And while that, yes, can lead to less complex projects, that also means that projects don't go through key population centers and can undermine their own success. In contrast, when we looked at tram projects abroad, we found that those fully at-grade projects run right through the middle of existing arterials, take lanes from cars, and go through the heart of the urban cores and neighborhoods that they serve, often at a similar cost per kilometer or cost per mile. And again, while that can lead to a more complex project and require more work and coordination, at the end of the day, those projects provide more utility and transit access to the communities that they serve. And so one of our key recommendations is that project sponsors should weigh the trade-off between cost, complexity, ridership, and access when considering alignments, because you may be able to shave off some costs by routing a transit project through freight rail or freeway rights of way, or in the median of a highway, you may be sacrificing a ton of density and ridership that you might be missing as part of that trade-off. We also believe that federal money can be a very powerful tool to incentivize the increasing of standards of transit projects. So we recommend that the FTA and federal government require things like minimum zoning densities around stations and levels of development as a condition for funding, and to de-emphasize ridership in favor of other accessibility metrics as part of the grant-making process, so we can think more holistically about who has access to the transit lines we're building, how many jobs and how many residents are we serving in the radius of these stations. The final point I'll make, as Brian mentioned, is that the issue of betterments comes up quite frequently, and there's often a tendency for agencies to try to make everybody happy and please everyone as part of the community engagement and stakeholder engagement process, rather than, again, focusing on maximizing the benefits of a project. And so we reiterate a recommendation here to develop a clear policy for how and when stakeholders can request betterments, how those requests are processed, who is required to foot the bill in a specific case, And in what cases can an agency say no? Because when these requests can certainly be helpful, and it's always helpful to be mindful of community concerns and requests for enhancements. When they come too late in the game and they come too often at the point where the project is already under construction, that can lead to costly change orders and delays and redesign of the project. So this recommendation here just holistically focuses on the need to really think through how we make successful projects that are useful, have utility, and serve populations that need transit access, and really thinking through the trade-offs when you make decisions about project alignments. And so I'll hand it back off to the team, and I believe we are ready to start taking questions.
That's right, we
Okay.
are. Let me flip to the last page. Brianne.
Yes, so I will be guiding the Q&A here. A bunch of great questions have already come in. Feel free to continue submitting those. All three of us will be jumping in on all of these as we can, but I'll try to direct them as much as possible. So I'll start with one here that, and I'll give this to you, Ramik. So somebody asked about how much of the US cost and time premium is specific to New York City in the US, and how much disadvantage are we left with versus overseas countries when looking at New York City?
That's a great question. And so when we ran the numbers, we purposely ran two sets, one with and without New York. So when we exclude New York City, for fully at-grade projects, which don't include the New York City projects, since they're all tunneled subway projects, we pay 50% more for at-grade projects. When we exclude New York City, we pay about 50% more for tunneled projects. That number rises to 253% when you include the New York City project. So when we look solely at as-built, currently built projects, the New York City projects certainly make our tunneling premium much worse, but we still pay 50% more when we exclude those projects. As you'll see in the report in the data section, we also took a look at some of the tunneled projects that are being built in Los Angeles and Seattle, and some of the newly proposed projects, including the downtown transit tunnel in Austin. And if we were to still exclude New York and factor in all of the subway projects that are currently under construction, our cost premium would rise to just over 100%. I believe it was 120%. And so while New York is a significant driver when we look at projects that have been built, there's still a ton of other projects that are being built in this country that are rivaling New York City on a cost per mile basis. So to answer your question, it's a very significant driver, but we still pay a lot more, even excluding New York City.
And I'm going to add one quick thing to that, Brian, if it's okay. The other component of this is that we focused this effort for a couple of reasons on the U.S. and then Western Europe and Canada. If you expand the scope, right, and look at some other countries, like South Korea and Japan and Turkey and Chile, other places, that is looking like it could be even greater. And so that's the subject of some future work that we're working on right now that'll be forthcoming. And so just know that this is comparing to Western Europe and Canada, not the entire world. So it could be even a greater premium.
Excellent. And there's another question on, did the research consider the FTA's capital investment grant process, perhaps comparing, how other agencies, other nations around the world fund transit project decision making? And then if so, are there any recommendations for improving the CIG process? And what I'll say there is we are actually in the middle of conducting some research on how other countries. So for this research that we have described today, we had 4 international case studies, mostly focused on Western Europe, and we are in the middle of conducting additional research, not quite as deep of a dive, but we're looking at 10 other countries around the world. So Japan, South Korea, Australia, several others. So stay tuned for that. I don't know if my colleagues want to add anything else to that question, but stay tuned for more research.
Yeah, so the CIG process is really interesting, and it comes up a couple times. And so I also see a couple questions about some details in here. A lot of the stuff that we talked through on this is detailed in the report, which you can download for free and really dive into some of the specifics. In those specific recommendations, we mentioned CIG as this tool where we can really use the carrot of federal money to get better outcomes. And so we have a recommendation in the governance section where, as part of the CIG application process, there can be a governance review and perhaps some requirements that agencies beef up and prepare their governance of their institutions, or create a new institution to deliver the project effectively. And similar to what Ramik was talking about on the last slide, the CIG process can also use its criteria to get better outcomes for the projects that we're building. And so that's definitely a very powerful tool to use, and we should absolutely be leveraging it in as many ways as we can.
Great. This next one, Paul, I will direct at you. So someone's asking just for a little bit more information about the funding and construction authorities or special purpose delivery vehicles that were set up in Madrid and Copenhagen.
Yeah, so it's really, really interesting. And so in Madrid, and again, there's a lot of this details in the paper, the funding for local transit projects, metros and subways, light rail, has to come only from the regional government. There's almost no federal money involved. So it is a regional government project and fully funded that way. And so the regional government created this institution called Mintra to build the subways in the late 90s and early 2000s that had the authorities it needed to both plan and execute these very, very complicated projects. And it was tremendously successful. Not wholly because of that, but I think that was a significant part of it. Similarly, in Copenhagen, in that instance, that was funded in large part through value capture. But in that case, given that it was the capital city and the largest city in Denmark, it was a project of the national government. The national government created a land development corporation that was tasked with building the subway, that eventually morphed into the operating agency. But it was designed as an institution to build the subway system and develop land that helped fund that whole system. And so in both cases, those institutions were created with the only purpose of building that infrastructure. And so they, both in their authorities and in their board structure and in their mandates, there were no distractions.
Excellent. This next question is a methodology question, so I'll direct this at Ramik. So someone's asking how we handled any differences in how costs are reported and which costs are included across different countries and different projects. So how do we normalize the cost data to ensure the apples to apples comparisons? And then did our analysis only look at project costs, or did we also compare labor hours in our data?
So we did not compare labor hours. That was a granularity that we weren't able to access in terms of our data search. On the question of methodology, this is the key issue when in this area of construction cost comparisons, and something that has been well documented by the GAO and others who have attempted to do this work. Every city, every region, every country has its own way of reporting costs. The FTA has a standard cost category that breaks down costs by, for rolling stock, for support facilities, for land acquisition, for administrative buildings. And so wherever possible, we sought to get that data. Some of those projects are included in the FTA's capital cost database. Some projects have before and after studies that have been published, and so we were able to go in and access some of that breakdown. So what we did is wherever possible, we tried to pull out rolling stock data. That is something that we really wanted to compare the actual infrastructure that is being built. And so in our database, wherever possible, we found and took that out, both internationally and abroad. To normalize the data, we converted currencies using purchasing power parity, PPP rates, which is a better indicator of purchasing power than just using the exchange rates. And we also adjusted for inflation using a engineering producer price index, a construction cost index that more accurately captures cost inflation for construction projects, as opposed to just using the consumer price index, which includes household goods and housing prices and automobiles, et cetera, and other consumer goods. So we focused much of our standardization efforts on inflation and currency. The next phase of this work is going to try to drill into some of the cost breakdowns and data that we have from the FTA, or that the FTA does collect on various elements of projects. But again, yeah, this is you're right on in the sense that there are a variety of reporting structures, and even when we FOIA'd, cost data, we saw that, some agencies, if the project is wholly locally funded, the agencies have their own method of instead of categorizing costs by rolling stock and facilities, they categorize it based on project phase, so planning and construction and environmental review. So we kept an eye out for that wherever we could. We were able to try to isolate the raw infrastructure costs as much as possible.
Okay, this next one I think gets at a point that Paul brought up in the governance section about having smaller segmented contracts. And so this person is asking, wouldn't the recommendation for smaller segmented contracts defeat the advantages and economies of scale of design build projects? And then another similar question was, if agencies do use smaller broken up construction contracts, do they have correspondingly less leverage to enforce standardized contract terms?
So those are great questions, and this is something that we weren't expecting to find when we dove into it, but it was pretty consistent in Europe that they had these contracts that rarely exceeded $300 million in their value, and when we talked to folks there, they really kind of highlighted that as a big advantage to projects, and they've cited a bunch of examples about when there were issues that they could address it with that one contractor, or they could fire a contractor and then bring on others to fill in that gap. It does create a little bit of extra work on behalf of the public agency staff to manage that and make sure there is standardization and there is, the lines do meet up and there's not, clunky interfaces with the different segments. But that seems to be outweighed by the fact that you bring in more competition, you have a more manageable bite-sized chunk, I guess, of line to manage. I think that there are some arguments you can make that there's, larger contracts are economies of scale, right? And the DB argument is one of those. You can still do design build on a smaller scale, and that can be done. And in other countries, they do tend to rely more on design bid build, and they tend to have greater success. It's hard to pinpoint exactly what, if those things are correlated, but I think by and large, having smaller contracts, design build or design bid build, seems to be much more manageable and have a lot more advantages than multi-billion-dollar contracts that we tend to go with here in the US.
Great, thank you. So I'll take an initial stab at this next one. If anybody wants to jump in, that's great. So someone was asking, what authority does FTA or the FRA have currently to require or incentivize standardization, either within a single system or just across operations in the US more generally? And I think, a lot of that comes in the funding process. So again, getting back to the capital investment grant question that somebody else asked earlier, we can set up, and maybe this isn't the current structure necessarily, but I think that the way that we structure funding could be used to incentivize standardization. I think a lot of this also gets to the point that we've made about cross collaboration between federal agencies and making sure that the agencies that are involved in making decisions about these projects, both at the federal level, but then also between different modes maybe, or between the federal and state and local levels. I think just having better coordination can help to, first of all, agree on what those standards could and should be, and then ultimately decide how to get there. I don't know if anybody has anything to add on the point about standardization, though.
I think it was well said.
Great. Let's see. If not, I will move on to. So another question was about how Buy America requirements constrain us from, having maybe effective processes and well, I guess I'll leave it at that. There was another standards question, but what research did we do on the Buy America process, or any comments on that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I don't think that Buy America limits us to do any kind of standardization per se. The Buy America seems to have more of an effect on the rolling stock components of projects rather than the infrastructure and track components. And our research really didn't go into the rolling stock. Yeah, it's I think a important thing for us to look at in the future, but we weren't really focused on the rolling stock. But the interesting thing that we found is that there's Buy America, and then there's Buy American, which is a separate law. And there's been several GAO reports and other reports about Buy American and its effect on procurement costs of the federal government and of other agencies. But there's relatively little research focused on Buy America and its effects on infrastructure. And so one of our recommendations is that we need to have a little bit more research, and the federal government needs to take the lead on developing some research on how Buy America affects transit projects, both on the rolling stock and the hard infrastructure piece. And when we did talk to folks about Buy America, the thing that came up was not so much the challenge with the extra costs associated with it, but rather the onerous process in which they have to go through to ensure compliance. And so the administrative burden associated with Buy America seemed to have a greater effect, at least of the people we talked to, than the actual procurement law itself.
Excellent. So this next, I'm going to lump together a couple of questions. Somebody asked about the political influence that maybe affects the ability, at least here in the US, to deliver large-scale transit projects, and if we saw that in any other countries, if on the one hand we saw the political interference, and then also how that's dealt with elsewhere. And then somebody else had asked a sort of related question about convincing voters for funding to build transit systems, and I think those two things are really related, of just how political the process can ultimately be. So what are some lessons that that were uncovered in our interviews about political interference?
Yeah, I'll start, and you all can jump in if you've got another comment. But one of the most compelling stories that came up was that of in Spain, right? If you look at the data and you look at what we've written, the subway build out in Madrid that spanned from 1997 or so to the early 2000s was just incredible in terms of the quantity that they built and the price at which they built it. And a big factor in that was that there was a broad political coalition or agreement that transit was good and Madrid needed to build more transit. And in fact, in the regional government parliamentary elections, you had the conservatives and the socialists competing as to how much transit and how many miles or kilometers of subway they were going to build. And ultimately, the conservatives promised more subway kilometers during their term, and in large part because of that promise, and they outpromised the socialists, the conservatives won, and then they were able to deliver on that and then win the next election because they were able to deliver on that. And it just goes to show, I think, that when you have a broad political coalition, it makes it much, much easier, which in this country we don't, right? And we don't have agreement that transit is good generally in many cases, and transit often has to fight for its own existence, and that puts it at a pretty serious disadvantage. Part of our recommendations get at that by just building better transit projects will help build more public support, right? When more people are using it, when it's more useful for folks, when we de-emphasize ridership and we focus on accessibility, then we may build the broader coalitions to say, yes, this is something that we actually want in our neighborhood. And then it's just kind of a broader thing that we need to address as an industry, kind of showing how transit can and should be an integral part of the accessibility in our metropolitan regions.
Any final thoughts on that, Rhonda?
In the interest of time, no.
Okay. Well, I think that's a really great note to end on, and kind of summarizes the purpose of this work and why this topic is so important. So with that, I will say thank you to everyone for your time. Here's our contact information. You can feel free to reach out to any of us if you'd like to ask us any additional questions. I would also encourage everyone to look into our symposium that we will be hosting on this topic October 18th through 21st. So 4 days, we'll be able to do a much deeper dive on all of these topics, and we'll also have external experts joining us to talk about these issues. Thank you so much for your time, and have a great afternoon.